At the beginning of May 1943, the Allies were poised to seize Tunis and win their first land campaign against Axis forces. Victory was only days away, but the fighting was still fierce. When the campaign ended, 275,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner. Behind this Allied victory lay a unique operation undertaken by one of the most remarkable submarines of the war, HMS Seraph, a specialist in secret missions. She was about to save thousands of young Allied lives. Seraph was also unique, the only Allied warship in which dual command was exercised between the Royal Navy and the US Navy. 2 captains and 2 flags. Her British captain was the 28-year-old Lieutenant Norman Limbry Auchinleck Jewell, universally known as Bill. But for part of Seraph's first secret mission in the Mediterranean, Jewell shared command with the American captain Gerald Wright. Between them, they hoped to change the course of the war. Seraph was to survive the war to become the oldest serving submarine in the Royal Navy. But her first secret mission came only a few months after the completion of her sea trials in May 1942. Launched in November 1941, Seraph was an S-class submarine armed with 6 21-inch torpedo tubes in her bow and mounting a 3-inch gun on her foredeck. She carried 12 torpedoes, and her crew of 44 officers and ratings were housed in extremely cramped quarters, the traditional lot of the submariner. Seraph's disarmingly modest commander was over 6 feet in height, and like many fighter pilots and submariners, almost incongruously tall for the confined space of his command. In 1939, the Mediterranean was a naval theatre dominated by the French fleet. The architect of French naval power was Admiral Jean Dallon, commander of the French Navy. A French naval rearmament program had got underway in 1938 as the threat of war with Germany steadily grew. But few ships of this program were destined to see much action in combat. Nevertheless, as war loomed, the combined Mediterranean fleets of the French and British outnumbered the third naval power in the area, Italy. France and Britain fielded 3 aircraft carriers, the Italians, none. British and French battleships on station and under construction outnumbered the Italian capital ships by 11-4. While the Franco-British superiority looked good on paper, it masked the fact that the British tended to concentrate their elderly units in the Mediterranean. And in contrast to the Italians and French, the British stationed less than a dozen submarines in the theatre. But the naval balance of power was shortly to be upset. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany invaded France. German armor and air power proved too much for the French army and their British allies. By the 14th of June, the swastika was fluttering from the Eiffel Tower. And Adolf Hitler made his first and last visit to Paris, the conqueror as tourist. 4 days earlier, Hitler's ally, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, had declared war on France. Mussolini had hung back from supporting Hitler until it was abundantly clear that the French were beaten. He now launched 2 armies across the Alpes-Maritimes to seize the juicy titbit of the French Riviera. Only 4 French divisions stood in their path, but they held off the Italians with little difficulty. Eventually, the Italians were reduced to begging the Germans for transport aircraft to land a battalion behind the French lines as a token of success. It was an early indication that Hitler's Italian ally would prove a hindrance rather than a help to Germany's strategic ambitions. The Battle of France was over, and its aged leader, Marshal Philippe Pétain, now submitted to the division of his nation. The Germans occupied all the northern and western parts of France, including Paris and the Channel and Atlantic ports. Pétain nominally ruled the rest, including France's colonies in North and West Africa and Indochina. Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, was now concerned about the fate of the French fleet. If Germany or Italy got their hands on it, the Royal Navy's position in the Mediterranean would be gravely threatened. The Royal Navy would have to prevent this. The major units of the French battle fleet were anchored in the harbour at Mers el-Kabir in Algeria. On the 3rd of July 1940, a British task force commanded by Vice Admiral Somerville attacked Mers el-Kabir. It sank the battleship Bretagne and seriously damaged 2 others, Dunkerque and Provence, as well as the destroyer Mogador. 1 battleship and several destroyers escaped to Toulon. In the action, the French sustained over 1,000 casualties. The operation achieved its purpose, but was to leave an enduring legacy of bitterness between Britain and France. With France out of the war, mainland Italy and her colony in Libya straddled the Mediterranean. Italy's navy and air force threatened to cut Britain's strategic link between Gibraltar and Alexandria, the base of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet. On paper, the Italians seemed to hold an advantage. They now outnumbered the Royal Navy, which had been forced to redeploy several major units, and they possessed more modern ships. But for all its dash, the Italian Navy was not an asset its high command was prepared to risk in a fleet encounter with the British. Anticipating a British capitulation which would bring the war in the West to an end, Mussolini was resolved to keep his fleet intact. The commander of the British Mediterranean fleet, Admiral Cunningham, was a fighting sailor whose principal task was the destruction of the Italian battle fleet and the maintenance of the supply routes to Malta and Egypt. Cunningham could not afford to adopt a passive role. On the 9th of July 1940, under the command of Cunningham, Admiral Somerville's Force H, based in Gibraltar, and the Mediterranean fleet based in Alexandria had engaged the main body of the Italian fleet between Sardinia and Calabria, inflicted damage on it, and forced it to retire. Cunningham was aware that control of the central Mediterranean and the battlefield of North Africa was crucially dependent on the retention of Malta, the island 50 miles south of Sicily. Malta was heavily garrisoned and defended by aircraft and coastal artillery, but its survival depended on regular convoys from Gibraltar. These came under sustained attack from the Italian Air Force. Both sides took heavy casualties. but Malta survived. In November, Cunningham decided to use his carrier-borne aircraft to launch a daring strike against the Italian naval base at Taranto, on the heel of Italy. Swordfish biplanes, obsolete but highly effective, hit Taranto at night in 2 waves. The results were spectacular. 3 battleships were badly hit. 2 remained under repair for several months, and the 3rd never came back into service. The Italian battle fleet withdrew from Taranto. The Italians were faring no better in North Africa. In December 1940, the British Western Force, commanded by Field Marshal Wavell, defeated a much larger Italian army which had crossed into Egypt from Libya. The British drove the Italians back 500 miles. They took 130,000 prisoners along the way. Italian disaster piled on disaster. In October 1940, Mussolini, in a fit of pique over not being consulted about the German occupation of Romania, mounted an invasion of Greece from Albania. The Italian advance was broken up by the Greeks, who pressed on to eject the Italians from most of Albania. Field Marshal Wavell was ordered to send British reinforcements to bolster the Greeks. But when Germany launched its own invasion of the Balkans in April 1941, the British soon faced their 3rd major evacuation of the war. The German transports, which flew over the Parthenon in Athens, were next employed in an airborne invasion of the island of Crete, held by 10,000 Greek troops and 32,000 British soldiers evacuated from mainland Greece. Desperate fighting followed the first landings on the 20th of May. But the German capture of the vital airfield at Malemi secured victory. Crete was abandoned to the Axis. In North Africa, the British faced a new opponent, General Erwin Rommel, who had been appointed in February 1941 to command the German troops sent to support the Italian army in North Africa. In the summer of 1942, Rommel inflicted a major defeat on the British 8th Army, captured Tobruk, and pursued the British into Egypt. But his lines of communication were now stretched to breaking point. And his tanks were running short of fuel. It was at this crucial moment, as the battle in the Western Desert moved towards its climax, that HMS Seraph arrived in the Mediterranean to join the Royal Navy's 8th Submarine Flotilla. The submarine war was always hazardous, and conditions in the Mediterranean made it doubly so. The sea's clear blue waters made it relatively easy for patrolling aircraft to spot submarines under the surface. And the Italian Navy's habit of hugging the coastline, where the waters are shallow, denied British submarines the safety of depth. On patrol, the submarine's routine turned day into night. When the sun was up, the ship stayed submerged. Breakfast was served when darkness fell, and then the day's work began. On the 19th of September, Seraph sailed on her first mission, carrying a party of Navy canoeists to reconnoiter beaches on the coast of Algeria. The canoeists went ashore by night. By day, Seraph cruised off the shore, taking photographs through her periscope. Seraph's crew already had an inkling that an Allied invasion of North Africa was on the cards, but no one knew where or when. Rumors in Gibraltar were rife. For the moment, they concentrated on the task of intelligence gathering. By the time they returned to Gibraltar, on the 12th of October, they were experts on the coastline of Algeria. While Rommel struggled with a shortage of supplies, British 8th Army was undergoing a massive build-up. The troops came from Britain and the Empire, the tanks from America. The Eighth Army's new commander, General Montgomery, was confident that he could break Rommel in a battle of attrition. In London in July 1942, the British and Americans had agreed to a joint invasion of North Africa. This was considered as a second-best option to a cross-channel invasion, which could not be risked as early as 1942. Torch, as the North African invasion was codenamed, would provide employment for an American army gathering in England and training hard at home. It also provided a role for part of Britain's home reserve, surplus to strategic requirements now that the threat of German invasion had receded. The Americans were supremely confident, but this was to be their baptism of fire. One worrying question hovered over Torch. What sort of reception could this invasion force of untried troops expect from the 150,000 Vichy troops garrisoned in France's North African colonies? When the troop ships sailed from America, this question remained unresolved. In command of Torch was the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike, as he was universally known, had been born in Texas of German immigrant stock in 1890. His career was to take Ike a long way from Texas. He had trained at West Point Military Academy and by 1920 had reached the rank of major. When America entered the war, Eisenhower was chosen to be the chief of the War Plans Division and then chief of the Operations Division by the Army's Chief of Staff, General George Marshall. In the same year, Eisenhower was appointed commander of U.S. troops in Europe. Torch consisted of 3 task forces: Western, transported directly from the United States to land at Casablanca; Central, sailing from Britain to Oran; and Eastern, an Anglo-American force whose target was Algiers. They would land just after a major assault was launched against Rommel at El Alamein. The American and British attitudes towards Vichy were sharply divergent. The Americans had maintained diplomatic relations with Pétain's government and were prepared to do business with it. From June 1940, the British regarded Vichy as part of the enemy camp. In France itself, Pétain remained popular. There was a strong French fascist movement. In North Africa, memories of the British attack on Mers el-Kabir were still fresh. In Central Africa, however, there was support for the exiled Free French leader, General Charles de Gaulle. But the allegiance of the military in North Africa remained with Pétain and Vichy. It was the task of American diplomats to pick their way through this minefield of shifting loyalties. The most important among them was the U.S. diplomatic agent in North Africa, Robert D. Murphy, a man with French friends in high places. With the consent of the anti-Nazi General Weygand, then the commander of French forces in North Africa, Murphy had established an intelligence network. In the weeks before the Torch landings, Murphy was secretly summoned to Washington to make a personal report to the President and General Marshall. Murphy told Marshall that much depended on 3 key figures in Vichy France. The most pro-American senior officer was General Charles Mast, deputy commander of the French forces in Algeria. Mast was eager to organize a clandestine meeting with the Americans. A much more powerful figure, however, was the enigmatic Admiral Dallon, now Pétain's deputy. If the Americans were prepared to deal with Vichy, Might not Darlon succeed the aged and discredited Pétain? The joker in the pack was General Henri Giraud, the hero of both world wars, now under virtual house arrest in Vichy France, who'd been working secretly to bring France into the war on the Allied side. In contrast, Darlon had sworn allegiance to Pétain, and was now commander-in-chief of Vichy's armed forces. But he had indicated to Murphy that his men in North Africa might turn against Germany if the Americans landed in sufficient strength. It's not surprising, perhaps, that in this maze of maneuvers, Robert Murphy was beginning to lose his way. Would the Torch invasion force be greeted by flowers or bullets when it landed in North Africa? With the invasion now less than 3 weeks away, it was vital for the Allied High Command to know. They decided to take up Mast's request and dispatch a top-secret mission to Algeria to talk to pro-Allied elements in the Vichy military. Mast was given the code name Flagpole. He would be the first port of call. Eisenhower wanted to go himself, but the man chosen to head the mission was his deputy for Torch, General Mark Clark. The gangling, dynamic Clark had enjoyed a meteoric rise in the US Army, being only a lieutenant colonel in 1940. Clark could not act as a one-man band. As the preparations for the mission went ahead in London in an atmosphere of feverish haste, he assembled the delegation which would meet General Mast and, it was hoped, determine exactly what was going on in North Africa. Its members included Brigadier General L.L. Lemnitzer, head of the Allied Forces Plan Section, whose task was to gain information about Vichy French military deployments. Colonel J.C. Holmes, a former State Department official who it was hoped could help to steer a way through the diplomatic minefield. Colonel Arch Hamblin, one of Torch's shipping and supply specialists, who would try to glean information about harbour capacities. And Captain Gerald Wright of the US Navy, Eisenhower's naval liaison officer. At dawn on the 19th of October, Clark and his delegation took off for Gibraltar in 2 B-17s, one of which was piloted by Major Paul Tibbets, the man who on the 6th of August 1945 dropped the atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The American delegation took with them thousands of dollars in gold coins and notes stuffed into money boats. Bribery might be necessary if things turned ugly in Algeria. On their arrival in Gibraltar, Clark and his colleagues were whisked off to Government House, the residence of the Governor-General, General Sir Frank Mason McFarlane. At this point, Seraph entered the story. Bill Jewell was now informed that his submarine had been allocated to special political operations. The signal from the Admiralty continued, "Utmost discretion in briefing of officers is necessary, and all further orders are to be destroyed after committal to memory." Jewell's flotilla commander told him that he was to prepare to receive some unexpected guests. Seraph was to be ready to put to sea at any moment. The pace of events was quickening at Gibraltar, where Eisenhower would soon establish his headquarters in a war room buried deep inside the rock. At Government House, Jewell discovered just how special were the guests he would be carrying and the nature of the political operations to which Seraph had been assigned. For not only would Seraph be carrying Clark and his delegation to North Africa, but she would also be playing host to their minders. 3 British commandos were to accompany the Americans under the leadership of Captain Godfrey B. Jumbo Courtney. Courtney and his companions, Captain Livingstone and Lieutenant Foote, were well known to Jewel from training exercises at Scotland's Holy Loch. They were armed to the teeth and ready for anything, but ignorant of exactly what lay ahead. However, the training exercises in Scotland did provide a clue. The commandos were expert operators of folding canvas canoes, known as fallboats. These craft were to take Clark and his men ashore when they made their rendezvous with General Mast in Algeria. Unfortunately, none of the Americans had had the time to practice with them. Meanwhile, in Algeria, Murphy continued to play an intelligence game which was largely of his own imagining. In London, Eisenhower became increasingly fretful about the lack of any firm indication of the true intentions of the Vichy army, or the remnants of the French fleet, which were harbour-locked but still dangerous. Perhaps Mark Clark, now aboard Seraph and sailing south, would provide the answer. At 4 a.m. on the morning of the 21st of October, Seraph arrived off her target beach at Cherchell, 50 miles west of Algiers. Jewel identified the red-tiled building, an empty farmhouse set back from the beach, where Clark was to meet General Mast. Then, as it grew light, Seraph sailed into deeper water and submerged. She was to return when darkness fell, and at 11 p.m., after an agonizing wait, a prearranged signal light was flashed from the house. This was the moment for Clark, his mission, and the 3 commandos to paddle the 500 yards to the shore. They had taken the precaution of breaking the voyage from Gibraltar to practice the maneuver. Now it was for real. A tense hour later, the commandos signaled and then radioed that everyone was ashore and that the right reception committee was waiting for them. Seraph slipped away into the darkness to recharge her batteries and to wait. General Mast was waiting in the farmhouse, accompanied by the ubiquitous Robert Murphy and a gaggle of staff officers. Seraph was making her way 8 miles out to sea. Clark and his colleagues were now on their own. Clark himself now became entangled in the web spun by Murphy. Murphy urged that Mast should place himself behind Darlon, but Mast claimed that his loyalty was to Giraud. Furthermore, as a condition of his support, Mast demanded details of the invasion, particularly the British involvement. The day passed and night drew in. As the wrangling continued, some Vichy customs officials decided to pay a visit, having been alerted about the comings and goings at the previously empty house. Perhaps there were smugglers abroad that night. They decided to investigate. Clark and his colleagues avoided capture by disappearing through a trap door into the cellar. Above them, while they held their breath, Mast and Murphy managed to convince the customs men that they had interrupted a drinking party. Time was now running out for the Americans. Released from the cellar, Clark's delegation and the commandos returned to the beach, hoping to make a speedy re-embarkation on Seraph. But the weather had changed for the worse. The sea was rising, and the surf was rapidly becoming impossible for the frail fallboats to negotiate. Jumbo Courtney nearly drowned Clark in an abortive attempt to get off the beach. It was decided to wait for the storm to die down before another attempt was made. The men could not return to the house, so they waited in the dunes. This unwelcome vigil gave Clark time to ponder the results of his meeting with General Mast. Clark had refused to discuss Allied plans, or disclosed that part of the invasion force was on its way. But he had gained some important information: the tonnage capacities of the invasion ports, the French Navy's plans for repelling a landing, where resistance was likely to be tough and where it might be token. In the early morning of the 23rd, Seraph crept in to within 300 yards of the shore. The sea was still rough, but Courtney's binoculars picked out sentries to the east and west of them. It was decided that another attempt must be made. Clark, for reasons which have never been explained, left his uniform trousers on the beach, the name tag unremoved. One of the foal boats was swamped. Documents and gold dollars and a tangle of weapons were lost in the waves. They were later to be decorated for their mission and form the exclusive North African Canoeists Club. By the time Clark had returned to Gibraltar, General Montgomery had launched the offensive against the Africa Corps at El Alamein. After a bitter dogfight lasting 10 days, 8th Army broke through, and the Africa Corps began the long retreat through Libya towards Tunisia. At Seychelles, Mast had been adamant that in the event of an invasion, cooperation would be assured by the presence on the spot of General Giraud. With time running out for the invasion, planned for the 8th of November, it was decided that Giraud must be brought back from the south of France. Seraph was again selected for a secret mission. After the meeting with Mast, Clark had promised Jewell that he would have a new job for him before very long. This was to be it. Contact had been established with Giraud, but he would have nothing to do with the British. He insisted that he would deal only with the Americans. So for her second secret mission, HMS Seraph was to become the USS Seraph, under the nominal command of Captain Gerald Wright. Once again, she set sail from Gibraltar, carrying Wright and another American officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bradley Gaylord of the U.S. Army Air Force. Also on board were Jumbo Courtney and his cheerfully cutthroat commandos. But now the white ensign had to be hauled down in favor of the Stars and Stripes, while the commandos struggled gamely to develop American accents. The man they were to snatch from Vichy, France, was no ordinary commander. He was a patriot, but one whom the Allies knew they had to handle with kid gloves. Giraud was given the codename Kingpin. At the beginning of the First World War, Giraud had been a dashing cavalry officer. The Western Front turned out to be no place for cavalry. Nevertheless, Giraud hit the headlines after he'd been taken prisoner with a daring escape from a POW camp in Germany. In the interwar years, Giraud came to prominence as an instructor at the École de Guerre, and later as the governor of the fortress at Metz. In May 1940, with the Battle of France already lost, Giraud had taken command of the 9th Army. It was a bankrupt military inheritance. The French front had collapsed. Once again, Giraud was captured and imprisoned in Germany. After 2 years of planning, he escaped. Back in Vichy, France, Giraud resisted all efforts to return him to Germany in exchange for French POWs. In the autumn of 1942, Giraud opened secret negotiations with General Mast. Giraud anticipated the Allied invasion plans and saw himself as the commander to take over when the Americans came ashore. Absent from these maneuverings was General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French in London. The Americans so distrusted de Gaulle that they preferred to deal with an adventurer like Giraud or the Vichyite Dallon. Liaising with London, the French resistance had arranged for Giraud to be picked up by submarine and taken to Gibraltar. The location of the pickup was to be the coastal resort of WW2. Another British submarine, HMS Sibyl, would also rendezvous with a second French party. Seraph was waiting for Giraud off a beach near WW2 on the night of the 5th of November. There were numerous delays, and finally the general had to be rowed out by a local fisherman. All this made for a particularly nerve-wracking operation for Jules and his men, aggravated by the presence nearby of a patrolling German E-boat, which fortunately failed to spot the surfaced submarine. When Giraud finally clambered aboard Seraph, it was clear that he saw through the deception of Seraph's reflagging. And to everyone's consternation, he spoke perfect English. Giraud also declined to put his name to a political statement prepared by Eisenhower, disingenuously declaring that he was a simple soldier who could not involve himself in politics. At this point, Seraph's radio transmitter broke down. The invasion fleet was now in the last stages of assembly, too massive a concentration to be concealed from German intelligence. The raw troops were readying themselves for battle. German naval intelligence was watching the progress of the invasion fleet, but had mistakenly concluded that it was a huge convoy bound for Malta. But the watchers were being watched. In Bletchley Park's hutted intelligence encampment, the codebreakers were monitoring every German move. Broken Luftwaffe codes provided the reassuring information that no reinforcements were being flown to North Africa as D-Day drew near. At this stage in the war, Ultra had achieved such a panoramic view of the German order of battle that it was possible to tell that units which could be moved were not being moved. In intelligence, the negative can also be very positive. Hitler and his high command could only ponder where the Allies might strike next. Meanwhile, with his radio out of action, Jules decided to break the rules by surfacing in daylight. This was immensely risky, as all Allied aircraft were now under orders to attack submarines on sight. Miraculously, the first plane they saw was the Catalina sent to search for Seraph, which was now long overdue back at Gibraltar. With some difficulty, Giraud was transferred to the Catalina and flown back to Gibraltar, and the councils of war being held on the rock by Generals Eisenhower and Clark. Eisenhower had his prize, but Giraud was proving a prickly customer, and he was in Gibraltar, not in Algiers. In the Western Desert, Rommel was conducting a skillful withdrawal, harried all the way by the methodical Montgomery. Axis prisoners were marched to the rear. The Desert Air Force controlled the skies. It was now 1 minute to midnight in the Vichy colonies in North Africa. Decision time for the Vichy French forces there and their commanders. Murphy made a last appeal to General Juin, commanding Vichy forces in Algeria, pleading with him to order his men to lay down their arms. Juin pointed out that any such order would be countermanded by Dallon, the real kingpin in the Torch scenario, who was now in Algiers, ostensibly on a private visit. Operation Torch went ahead at dawn on the 8th of November. Central and Western task forces received a hot reception from French naval units. The landings went in amid considerable confusion. At Casablanca, the troops who pushed inland were soon caught up in bitter street fighting. But the foxy Dallon, who had already ordered the surrender of Algiers, could see which way the wind was blowing. On the 11th of November, he signed an armistice with the Allies. The roundup of collaborators began. Dallon, the man the Americans had always wanted, was now in the Allied camp. Giraud and de Gaulle had been frozen out. Hitler's reaction was swift. His forces marched into Vichy, France. By the evening of the 11th of November, the whole of France was under German military occupation, and Pétain's government at Vichy had been reduced to a cipher. On the 27th of November, the French fleet at Toulon scuttled itself to avoid falling into Hitler's hands. Dallon's triumph was short-lived. On Christmas Eve 1942, he was assassinated by a young Gaullist fanatic. Rommel's days in North Africa were also numbered. He was recalled by Hitler on the 6th of March 1943. The campaign in Tunisia gave the Americans a healthy respect for their new enemy. But the hard fighting gave the men and their commanders the tough experience with which to face the struggle to liberate mainland Europe. Serif's two secret missions were vivid highlights in a distinguished career which lasted well beyond 1945. Bill Jewell and his crew had demonstrated that fortune favors the brave. Eisenhower had no doubts about the value of Serif's contribution to Torch. On his recommendation, Bill Jewell was awarded the Legion of Merit, the highest decoration permitted by the US Congress to be given to a foreigner. In Ike's estimation, Serif and her gallant crew had saved thousands of Allied lives.
Coming up on UK TV history, the great political mistake that led to a Prime Minister's downfall, Margaret Thatcher and the poll tax.